and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Malaysia's poverty line income has been revised to 2,208 ringgit, which according to Putrajaya brings the poverty rate in 2019 to 5.6%. Now, the PLI, the poverty line income, was last updated 14 years ago and was calculated according to the 2005 methodology, which benchmarked poverty at 980 ringgit. So the new calculations are based on the 2019 methodology, and this means that over 400,000 households in Malaysia are below the poverty line. So needless to say, the conversation continues as to the question of how to define poverty. That continues to persist.
Yeah, Melissa, I mean, sometimes, you know, these discussions might seem a bit arcane to many of us who don't quite understand what these numbers are. And in fact, brought down to, you know, the 8 ringgit there after the 2,200. You know, the question is, what is it that policymakers need to do?
Right.
And what is it that, you know, is the objective of this exercise, if not, in fact, to have more targeted programs? And I think that essentially is what the controversy is about.
Correct.
If you don't have the good data, if you don't have sound concepts, how do you then identify the right groups and create programs to help alleviate poverty in those particular communities?
So the previous poverty rate of 0.4%, I think many reports had quoted saying that Malaysians feel a sense of disconnect with official poverty statistics. I'm wondering now whether that will change and what else will change, right? Will there be a more accurate picture of poverty in Malaysia, and will that lead to better basis for policy making? Are we going to have evidence-based policy making based on this new figure of 5.6% of the poverty rate? I also want to point out, Sharaad, that Philip Alston, who was on the show yesterday, the former UN Special Rapporteur for extreme poverty, he mentioned that based on his calculation, it was more of 15 to 20% range of poverty in Malaysia. So I wonder how he would respond to these new official figures.
Yeah, and in fact, in the show that we had him on yesterday, he did suggest that he didn't think that the number would go up significantly. But we'll leave that aside. I think there is this whole bigger question of the kind of society that we want to be. And I think, the Rukun Negara discussion also helped tap into the fact that at the inception of the nation's establishment, there was a concern about a just society. So inequality is something that needed to be addressed. And, Dr. Mahathir, celebrating his 95th birthday today, talked about inequality, but he talked about it in racial terms, right? So he says that he will continue his fight against inequalities between communities. But I think today, maybe the Malaysian, this sense of what is important in terms of justice isn't about race, it's really about class, and how do we manage the income inequality and asset inequality and inequality of opportunities and access to good jobs and education.
Yes.
That is central, I think.
Definitely, and I do want to point out to multi-dimensional poverty, because yes, it's important to acknowledge that poverty is not just about income, right? Poverty is also about deprivation, about your deprivation profile. So you may have an income of more, your household may earn more than 2,208 ringgit. But what if, within where you live, you are deprived of, sanitation or utilities or internet connection or a handful, which in this day and age, it is considered an essential. And I do have to point one thing out. The conversation that's come out from these new poverty rates have been the minimum wage. So 1,200 ringgit for minimum wage is below what has been deemed as the poverty line. So perhaps we should have a conversation about that.
As you rightly point out, this is about household income, not individual incomes, right?
And how many members in that household too.
Indeed. So again, the statistics can be a bit of a sleight of hand. We have to be very careful when we bandy these numbers about. The media has to be very careful not to just spin this in terms of a kind of positive picture, really, but to ask critical questions of these numbers and to maybe do real on-the-ground reporting that gives us the stories of inequality in this country that will help illuminate the problem.
Well, the data just came out today. I'm sure that in the following days there will be more analysis as people digest the information that has been released. least. All right, well, let's do a quick follow-up on that police investigation on the Al Jazeera journalists who produced that controversial documentary on Malaysia's treatment of undocumented migrants. The Inspector General Police, Hamid Bador, has assured journalists, both local and foreign, of their safety while reporting in the country. Now, the Al Jazeera employees and their lawyers were seen going into the Bukit Aman police headquarters today, where they had been summoned to be questioned over that documentary. And Bukit Aman has clarified that, that the staff were, in fact, questioned as witnesses and not suspects. According to Hamid Bador, the police had taken action because they had received five reports from the public over the documentary, so they had to commence investigations.
Yeah, because, police reports, I could say to all Malaysians, keep it up. Police reports are good, and it seems to be a way of pushing the authorities to act in particular ways.
But no false reports, though.
Yeah, well, this is very interesting, right? So we have that instance of Tashmi Sukumaran for the South China Morning Post being hauled in for her reports on the EMCO, whereas the newspaper that had falsely said that migrants were throwing bags of urine and excrement at soldiers, denied by the military. They didn't get hauled up. So I'm wondering about the standards of who gets hauled up in this country is, I think, a very interesting question.
Well, again, the police are saying that they have to investigate based on those who make police reports. They received several reports on this and they had to look into it. But you're absolutely right. I'm wondering whether, why it is that the first thing we do when there are issues with a media's report, why is it the first thing we reach for is the Sedition Act? I mean, having a media council could be a more effective way than rather for reaching for the law, shall we say?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the question of maturity and the question of power, the question of who gets to define what is seditious and not seditious, and our tolerance for differences of opinion, I think is central. So I think what the IGP does in this latest statement he made is to assure that the police were following procedure. They were doing what they are meant to do, and that was all it is. It was an attempt to intimidate, as some people have suggested. But, of course, we have the situation of the person interviewed, one of the individuals interviewed in that documentary, and the use of the public media to put his picture up everywhere, to, in fact...
his passport number, his address,
and the questions are raised, I think, about the intention there. Was it, intentionally otherwise, conducive for a kind of mob mentality?
Exactly. Well, and I'm happy to hear that the IGP is saying that media gets the, he's assuring that media gets the protections for doing their jobs. I'm wondering whether Rayhan Kabir, the Bangladeshi man who was in that Al Jazeera interview, whether he gets the same assurances of protections as well. Well, that's something for the police to consider tonight. We're going to take a quick break. In just a few minutes, we're going to turn our attention across the causeway as Singapore's polls have just closed in their 13th general elections. Stay tuned to consider this.
Kini berwajah baru.
Ini pula susulan khas pesawat Back Air di Kazakhstan. Pesawat berkenaan dilaporkan tergelincir 2 kali.
Notifikasi berita terkini dan navigasi mudah. Podcast dikemas kini dengan berita dan program.
Rebirth, Reformasi, Resistance and Hope.
Serta video tanpa had dengan scroll tanpa henti. Buat turun aplikasi baru Astro AWANI sekarang.
Bayangkan pagi anda dengan pandangan dan perbincangan luar kota. Berita dan isu semasa yang wajib anda ketahui sebelum anda keluar rumah. Paparan terkini, kupasan mendalam. Kami temani anda di waktu pagi untuk hari yang lebih ceria dan produktif. Gigi Ahmad, Hafizi Azaman, Hakim Rahman, Hafizi Rosli dan Naila Huda. Semuanya di Awani Pagi.
Isra, apa benda rancak ni?
Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. After 9 days of campaigning, today Singaporeans cast their vote on whether to give the ruling PAP another mandate or to strengthen opposition representation in Parliament. Now, many issues emerged in the hustings, including the question of race and ethnic representation. In a piece titled, "Hello, I'm Not Your Model Minority," our next guest explores the ways in which the Malay community of Singapore has been framed within these existing debates. Mysara Aljaru is a Singapore-based writer and a postgraduate student. Mysara, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. Now, how have politicians addressed minority communities while campaigning? What were some of the main themes that you saw emerging during this time?
Hi, thank you so much, both of you, for having me. I think that, minority issues has always, obviously, been a very sensitive one. But I think with, social media is something that everyone is discussing. So one of the things that we heard from Lee Hsien-loong, the former Prime Minister, was that the new candidates for the People's Action Party or the PAP are basically a model Malays, because they come from diverse backgrounds.
Right.
But I think what is interesting in this year's elections or the campaign is that you have an opposition party coming in to say, hey, look, we need to start addressing structural issues. We need to start addressing issues that the Malay community face without looking at it through a racialized lens. I think that is a very important point that a lot of, I think, scholars, have written and researched about on how basically the Singapore government addresses minority or, in this case, Malay issues. So basically, I think that was the main thing that kept people talking about, who constitutes as a model Malay, in the eyes of the ruling party.
Mysara, can I ask you why you felt the need to write that piece at this point in time, and what is it that you were hoping to do with that piece? I thought it was fascinating, your discussions of the culturalist explanations from everything from obesity to whatever it is said to be a Malay problem in Singapore.
Yeah, so I think what my main point in writing that is to question who we deem as, a modern minority. I think everywhere around the world, people have written about the harm of, such a narrative, this very problematic modern minority myth, where, you are basically pinning minorities against each other. In this case, I can only speak on my experience as a Singaporean Malay, where, you are often in competition to kind of standard with the majority, in the eyes of the majority, whether you're acceptable or not. So in this process, sure, you can say that according to statistics, the Malay community has this and that, but are you addressing why, the statistics shows such number? Are you addressing, the kind of stereotypes that you have been imposing on the community since the colonial era, right? Are we addressing that, or are we just reproducing a lot of these sentiments? And I think a lot of us have seen that in, the Malay candidates from the ruling party, where I'm sure their intentions in wanting to serve the community, is respectable. But my question would be, how are you doing so? Are you addressing these barriers that the community faces, or are you just reproducing all these policies and structures that are preventing the community from addressing this issue? I think that was my main point.
That's very interesting, because also you note, you have to take note that in Singapore, much like in many other countries, the dominant community gets to define what is acceptable behavior for minorities. And you wrote in your piece that the model minority sentiment is both racist and elitist. I'm wondering, Mysara, if this narrative, this portrayal of Malays has been reflected in the media as well in Singapore.
Yes, so basically I'm doing my research on mainstream media discourse on Malay development, right? So if you were to look, and this is not a new research, I'm building up on it, people have written and researched about it, where if you look at the newspapers, for example, I think my piece I cited an example where in 2012, one of the mainstream papers, had a headline, over 50% of drug offenders are Malay, and they had a photo of like Malay men in baju kurung, like, you know, they could be going for prayers for all we know, right?
Right.
And the question remains, and that's not a new narrative, you see that in the 80s, even before that. So the question remains, you know, why are you racializing it, and how does certain portrayal by the mainstream media reproduces, you know, very racist sentiments? And, you know, and going back to and because, you know, if you were to look at the mainstream media and the links it has to the ruling party, you know, it really emphasizes this very problematic Malay narrative where the Malay community is always problematic. And to kind of counter that, what do you have? You have Malay elites from the ruling party who reproduces the, oh, you know, I came from humble beginnings, you know, and I made it, you know, so I'm the Malay that has made it. And if I can make it, so can you. But they have not addressed a lot of the structural issues that a lot of us have been researching and writing about. Yeah.
So, you know, there was, of course, you know, some police reports made in this campaign period, once against a candidate from the Workers' Party, I believe, and also against the Deputy Prime Minister, or at least formerly Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, Heng Swee Keat, for a statement he made about how older Chinese Singaporeans would not accept a minority Prime Minister. And I know there's a lot of discussions about Taman and whatever it is. I don't want to get into that, but tell us, what's at stake in this? Or why is it necessary to talk about the ethnic identity of the Prime Minister in meritocratic Singapore? Why does that matter?
I think that it's basically a reflection of, you know, this idea that, you know, who holds power in Parliament cannot be a minority. And of course, you know, for a lot of minorities, you know, it is an offensive sentiment. You know, the question is, why are you saying we can't lead? Are we not good enough? Don't we have the qualifications? Even though I think it has been proven and researched that, you know, Taman, you know, Minister Taman has been one of the more popular choices even by the local Chinese community. So, you know, I think it's a deeper issue than just, you know, getting angry about who gets to lead. But I think it's a reflection of years of, you know, not being able to kind of articulate or not being able to understand, I think, where this anger comes from. And I think with whatever is going on, I think especially, you know, I guess, you know, from what I see from a lot of the younger voters, you know, like myself and, you know, the generations after me, is that, you know, we want to talk about race. We want to talk about ethnic identity in Singapore, and we will not stand for, you know, or we don't believe in, you know, oh, you know, we don't want to rock the boat kind of excuse anymore. And I think that people are, especially the older generations, are starting to see that we are kind of having our own conversations, you know, with or without them, you know, and with all these sentiments going on, I think a lot of us hope that moving forward that, you know, we have an open discussion about, you know, race and policy, race and governance in Singapore.
Mysara, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate your time and your insights this evening. We're going to take a quick break, but more in just a few minutes, so stay tuned to Consider This.
Kini berwajah baru.
Ini pula susulan khas pesawat Back Air di Kazakhstan. Pesawat berkenaan dilaporkan tergelincir 2 kali.
Notifikasi berita terkini dan navigasi mudah. Podcast dikemas kini dengan berita dan program.
Rebirth, Reformasi, Resistance and Hope.
Serta video tanpa had dengan scroll tanpa henti. Buat turun aplikasi baru Astro AWANI sekarang.
Bayangkan pagi anda dengan pandangan dan perbincangan luar kota. Berita dan isu semasa yang wajib anda ketahui sebelum anda keluar rumah. Paparan terkini, kupasan mendalam. Kami temani anda di waktu pagi untuk hari yang lebih ceria dan produktif. Gigi Ahmad, Hafizi Azaman, Hakim Rahman, Hafizi Rosli dan Naila Huda. Semuanya di Awani Pagi.
Isra, apa benda Rancak TV ni?
Rancak TV ni adalah sebuah channel digital yang bernaung di bawah
Thank you for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our discussion about Singapore's general elections. Joining us now is Dr. Roy Anthony Rogers, Head of the Department of International Strategic Studies at Universiti Malaya. Good evening, Roy. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. Now, it seems that PAP wanted to frame this general election as a referendum on the fourth generation of party leadership. Was that how Singaporeans and also outside observers saw it as well?
All right. Hi, good evening. It's nice to be back. The last time I was with them in January, after a good 6 months. So, coming back to the question of the fourth generation, I would say that this general election is very significant in the history of Singapore and also for outsiders in Southeast Asia to observe. There are 5 major key points here. Number one, the significance of it first is calling for an elections while the COVID-19 is still climbing in Singapore. As you may know that, for example, yesterday it was 125 new cases. Today, I think it's 191. So it's quite significant in the sense that while the pandemic hasn't really been reduced in Singapore, but a general election is being called. And I would say this is a litmus test for neighboring countries if we were to hold a general election during this period. So Singapore becomes a litmus test for the region. Right. Number two, in regards to what you mentioned about the fourth generation, these elections, I would say, is a changing of guards election. Why do I say a changing of guards? It's because Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, or the formerly now he's the Secretary General of the PAP, have mentioned that he will call it a day when he reaches 70, and now he's already 68. So this may be his last general election as the Prime Minister of Singapore. And during this election, we will, or rather, witness some of the old guards of the PAP retiring, like Lim Swee Say, and also Kau Boon Kwan, the former Transport Minister, and also the advent of coming more significant role of the fourth generation, which you mentioned, that people like Ong Ye Kung, and the former Education Minister. And also, it may give an opportunity for the former Deputy Prime Minister, Heng Swee Keat, to make his debut eventually as Prime Minister. Right. So that is number two. Right,
but Roy, can I just interrupt you for this one? You know, the question of internal succession within the party, very interesting, because it's predicated on this idea that PAP is going to hold power forever, as it were, and that, you know, this is they will get the mandate, and so the real election is happening within the party. That is really who is going to be elected, and who the leadership is being determined not by Singaporeans as a whole, but by the party cadres. I mean, is there a resentment that PAP behaves as if it will hold power forever?
I mean, of course, in politics, there's something that you say hold power forever. But I would say, even in this general election, I would say that the PAP will somehow gain a majority. But based on 2015, they got 69%. Popular votes and 83 seats. But you have to understand, 2015 was a very significant year in the sense that that was the year where Singapore celebrated its 50th anniversary. Right. Everyone was in a jubilant mood. And plus, also, 2015 was the year where the founding father, that is Lee Kuan Yew's demise. So due to these two factors, that has somehow pushed the PAP's performance higher to 69%. Right. But this time around, I am not sure whether they will be able to get 69. I would say plus minus 5. Okay. It could be, even if there's an improvement, there will be an improvement of 5% from 69, or even if there is a decline, there may be a decline of around 5%. So sure. Even if a decline, it should be between 69 to 6.
this is all kind of happening while the story develops. As the show continues, we're keeping one eye on what's happening in Singapore with the results coming out from there. But I do want to get you to finish your 5 main points. So you pointed out too. You said this was a pandemic polls. You also said this was changing of the old guard. Can I get you to very quickly tell us what were the other 3 main interesting points about this election?
Other points that I would like to highlight is also in terms of related to the first point, that is campaigning during this COVID-19, which is very different from the previous elections. In the previous elections used to have public rallies, and it was a bit like a feast day, a fiesta. But now all the public rallies have been banned. So in return, as a replacement, there have been contactless rally, visiting home to home, and this is something different, and whereby candidates have to use online streaming to reach out to them. And another thing is interesting is about the opposition. Because this time around, you have the Prime Minister's younger brother, or the former Prime Minister's younger brother, Lee Xiangyang, who have been, in opposition in the PSP or Progress Singapore Party, and not forgetting Dr. Tan Cheng Bock, who was formerly an MP of the PAP. This is the first time in the history of Singapore whereby first, within the family, someone in the opposition, and also a significant leader from the PAP in his new party. And it's interesting to see how the PSP will really progress. Of course, the party is Progress Singapore Party, but how this party will progress, this is the first time they enter into the general elections. I don't deny the Workers' Party will continue to get support. Most probably, they may even retain some of their seats, the traditional seats. And it's interesting to look at the PSP with these 2 leaders. And lastly, my last 5th point will be, as we all know, that Singapore will be going into more difficult period due to the economic downturn, recession. So this is an elections before a hard-hit recession. So I think it is a strategic move also for the PAP to call for elections now, although they have their mandate until April 2021, I believe. It's better for them to call for elections now before things slide further down and people become dissatisfied, and that will affect the polls, the results. So that's why it's better to get the mandate from the people and move on.
Well, Roy, thank you so much for creating that listicle for us, the 5 key points about why this election was very interesting to watch here in Malaysia. So thank you for speaking with us tonight and for sharing your insights. That's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night, folks.